Well, thank you very much. I'd like to get started in my presentation. Today, the title is Oneness Through Two-ness, remaining focused on Amida Buddha's salvific working. So in the first talk with John Periskopoulos' very articulate talk, we had a talk of the present, and then with Kuwahara Sensei's very informative historical reference of talking about the past. I'd like to kind of see if my talk can kind of have a different angle than talking about, the past and how it's been transitioned over to the present day, and kind of see how that kind of fits into the first two talks. Okay, so I will get started now. So the Two Truths theory is a system of belief that acknowledges and distinguishes between two mutually exclusive worldviews within an individual or collective body, such as a religious organization. On the one hand, there is the supramundane truth, okay, in which the Buddha's law, or Buddha Dharma, is the highest principle. On the other hand, there is the mundane truth, where within this realm of the secular world, the king's law, or the law of the land administered by the ruling government, is held to be the highest principle. So these two truths are said to be equal in importance and mutually supportive of one another. The balance between these two truths is said to create a peaceful society. Okay? And so I believe it was Zonkaku Shonin who talks about there are two wheels of a cart or two wings on a bird. That the balance of these two will keep the bird or the cart to move forward. Okay? If we take into account the bifurcation of the external and internal, this the gesso or the naiso, Buddha's law, Buppo, and King's law, or Obo, and supramundane, and which is known as Shintai, and mundane, also known as Zoktai. These two truths theory has been in place for the majority of the history of Shin Buddhism since the time of Shinran Shonin. The two truths theory left a legacy which resulted in the questioning of the Shin identity, especially after World War II. Okay, so I'd like to just kind of give you a brief, just kind of show you what I'm picturing in my head here, okay? So here at the top diagram here, we have the mundane truth and then the supramundane truth being kind of on a balancing beam here with the fulcrum at the middle. And then what I'd like to kind of further talk about here is how the mundane truth, this kind of bifurcation of these two truths creates this possibility or the potential of the mundane truth kind of taking precedence or priority over the supramundane truth. And so this is kind of the framework of what I will be talking about today. Okay, so I'd like for you to look at my beautiful face here, so I'll go ahead and stop sharing that. So the Two Truths theory became the ethical policy of Honganji as a religious institution of Shin Buddhism, implemented in their affairs with general society and its societal issues. What this meant was that as a follower of the Jodo Shinshu tradition and member of Honganji, one was encouraged to hold in one's heart the doctrine of Shinran Shonin, but at the same time, at the outside of oneself, follow the rules, laws, and social customs of society as a whole. One example of this was the issue of Kami and Buddhas are mutual manifestations of each other, also known as Shinbutsu Shugo. And another one, manifestations of the original Buddha, also known as Honji Suijaku. This was the commonly held belief in Japan at the time by many Buddhist schools that the local Kami, and other beings such as Buddhas and Bodhisattvas were in fact the manifestations of the one central Buddha, or absolute truth. However, Shinran Shonin did not think it was necessary to pray to Kami and other Buddhas and Bodhisattvas, although it should be noted that he also did not disparage or ridicule them either, because it was Amida Buddha alone that would save sentient beings from the world of suffering. So in contrast to this, later leaders of Honganji, such as Kakunyo Shonin, Zonkaku, as well as Rennyo Shonin, did in fact recognize other Buddhas, Bodhisattvas, and Kami, which can be manifestations of Amida Buddha. And some scholars today argue that this was more of an attempt on the parts of those Honganji leaders to appease the status quo and the powerful Buddhist schools at the time, which sanctioned and condoned such beliefs. By Honganji recognizing the ideas of Kami and Buddhas are mutual manifestations of each other, Shinbutsu Shugo, and manifestations of the original Buddha, or Honji Suijaku, the new religious institution, Honganji, at that time would be seen as a legitimate Buddhist school by the other more powerful and already established Buddhist institutions. So here we see an example of the mundane truth, which in this case would be adopting the recognition of Kami as manifestations of Amida Buddha, and the super mundane truth, Amida Buddha's primal vow. And it is this bifurcation which can be understood as a syncretic approach to religion, which was common amongst Japanese society. And that is commonly understood to be the two truths theory, or Shinzoku Nitairon. Moving on then, towards the end of the Edo period, through the Meiji period, and onward until the close of World War II, Japan begins on a campaign of imperialism throughout Asia. It is during this time that the Meiji government implements what's known as state Shinto, a newly created set of customs and beliefs that would instigate a religious fervor among the nation's citizens that centered on the Emperor of Japan. The emperor would be considered a divine being, Japan would be a nation of Kami, and its citizens would be the divine children of that nation. Despite the fact that the Meiji Constitution recognized the separation of state and religion, the government cleverly labeled state Shinto as a non-religion, quote unquote, in order to bypass any criticism that this violated the constitutional right of the freedom of religion. So as such, the state Shinto beliefs and rituals, now considered a cultural aspect of Japan more than a religion, were forcibly implemented into all public schools in Japan, as well as any public and most private sectors. Citizens were encouraged, also mandated, almost mandated, to visit Shinto shrines and pray for the wellness of the emperor, for example, when he fell ill, or on his birthday, or any major victories that the imperial army saw overseas. As Imperial Japan constricts its hold on its citizens, the many Buddhist schools of Japan, including Nishi and Higashi Honganji, were slowly being forced to adopt state Shinto ideals alongside its own religious beliefs. Censorship of any criticism against the central government increased. For example, sections of Shinnan's works where he openly criticized the imperial court for its suppression of the Nembutsu movement, mainly the Kekan there, were deleted in publications at the time. Writings of past emperors and those praising the imperial household, works that have nothing to do with the Shin doctrine, were forcibly added into liturgical books as well as sacred texts. For Tokudo ordination and qualifications to preach outside of one's own temple, a ministerial aspirant had to pass a series of tests that involved subject matters that were Confucian or Shinto in nature, and nothing to do with Shin doctrine. In short, the Shin religious organizations had to quickly justify why it was openly implementing state Shinto in its religious doctrine. And what made that possible was none other than the two truths theory. By distinguishing state Shinto as the mundane truth, right, and Amida's primal vow as the super mundane truth, Nishi and Higashi Honganji were able to appease the concerns and criticisms of the central government, while at the same time justifying to its followers that it was still upholding Shinnan's teaching. They argued, as had been throughout its history, that the two truths theory maintained the idea that Buddhism and the secular government and the powers that be were always at peace with one another, and that the two sides were symbiotic. Buddhism maintained and ensured the spiritual well-being of its nation, while at the same time, the nation ensured the flourishing of Buddhism throughout the country. And Jodo Shinshu Buddhism would only be supporting this long-held tradition by maintaining the two truths theory and recognizing state Shinto. The problem that this created was the Shin Buddhist organization's eventual full-fledged support of the central government's demands, one of which was its imperial ambitions overseas. Furthermore, Honganji lost sight of its central teaching of Shinran Shonin during this time, and instead supported a belief system that was contrary to its central teaching. In short, the Shin religious organization eventually supported the mundane truth of state Shinto and completely ignored the supramundane truth, i.e. Amida Buddha's great wisdom and compassion. And this was to have a detrimental effect on the Shin Buddhist identity. Do we follow the Emperor of Japan instead of Amida Buddha? Are we to be more Japanese than Shin Buddhists now? Right? And this was the ethical identity crisis that the Honganji and its adherents faced at that time. When the war concluded, the two truths theory as the official ethical policy of Honganji ended as well. Honganji was able to focus again on the central message of Shinran Shonin. Since then, both Nishi and Higashi Honganji have officially apologized for their complicity and participation in the wars of aggression in Asia and in the Pacific. The two truths theory has since been abolished, or rather abandoned, and recent scholarship has exposed and brought to light many of the ways in which wartime Honganji policy deviated from its religious orthodoxy. But was the problem of the two truths theory resolved, I ask? What has since filled the void of the two truths theory? What is the ethical policy of Honganji today? I believe the characteristics of the two truths theory are, in fact, still evident in Shin Buddhism today. Of course, this is not to suggest that Jodo Shinshu in such places as America practice kami worship, right? I'm not trying to say that. Rather, I want to look at what the underlying features of the two truths theory are that are ultimately flawed and can possibly result in the same problem that was exhibited in the situation with Japan. The problem that I'm referring to here is the incoherent and inconsistent Shin Buddhist identity enabled by the two truths theory. So for Shin Buddhists who live outside of Japan, the phrase two truths theory, or Shinzoku Nitairon, is almost unheard of, right? Let alone a major problem. There are a number of reasons for this. First, there is no concept of state Shinto, emperor, or polytheistic Mikado system of kami veneration, right? More importantly, particularly in the United States history, the First Amendment of the Constitution guarantees the freedom of religion, and thus the separation of church and state was already a key feature of the country at its outset, at least on paper. And this would inevitably not give rise to the problem of the two truths theory, as the state cannot enforce a particular set of religious beliefs onto its citizens. Hence, the concern in the Western Shin Buddhist context is not whether the secular authority will usurp the Shin doctrine. The problem is more subtle than this, I believe. Rather, it is about how secular ideologies or worldviews take precedence and priority over the teaching of Amida Buddha's great wisdom and compassion. Thus, the two truths theory cripples the Shin Buddhist identity, as there is a shift in emphasis away from the core of Shinran Shonin's message. In the context of Shin Buddhism outside of Japan, and to some extent in Japan itself as well, the legacy of the two truths theory has not been adequately diagnosed and properly addressed. Thus, the two truths theory is still problematic because it enables the possibility to prioritize the mundane truth over the supramundane truth. So for the purposes of today's discussion, I will focus on the problem that the two truths theory prioritizes the mundane over the supramundane truth. That is, the two truths theory inevitably serves to undermine or replace the teaching of the Buddha Dharma with the rule of secular authority. And what I want to claim is that the secular authority in this case is not the US government or any other social institution, but rather the ideology of what people want Buddhism to be. Another way to look at this is the ideology of what people think Buddhism should be. And this is what I mean by the mundane truth. So I'd like to show you a diagram of this, of what I will be talking about. So there's the mundane truth over the supramundane. And so we have here in the supramundane side, I'll start here, are, the duality or the two-ness. I'll get to this later. And then the side that the supramundane, I guess, from the average person might see the supramundane truth as something to be too abstract, right, and unrelatable. It is also referring to Amida Buddha's salvific activity, and it's also referred to the Jodo Shinshu teaching itself. However, on the other side, the mundane truth, we have oneness, which is in contrast to duality. I'm going to talk about this later. That it is more perceived to be more concrete. It is perceived to be more real, right? More relatable. I can connect with this, right? And then what we perceive or want Buddhism to be, and then state Shinto in contrast to Jodo Shinshu. So this is what we already discussed, okay? So just to kind of give you a, I'm going to argue that here the mundane truth then starts to kind of take precedence, right? And this is the problem with the two truths theory, as it creates this possibility for one side to outweigh the other, okay? Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and close this again. Okay, so what the two truths theory does is to place both sides of the mundane, the supermundane truths on equal footing. That is to say that the ideology of a secular Buddhism, deprived of any notion of the soteriological aspect of the Buddha Dharma on the one hand, and then the doctrine centered on Amida's salvific working on the other, are now placed on equal footing, both carrying the same weight in its truth claim. This not only suggests that the two aspects should be treated equally in importance, but furthermore, it creates the possibility for the Nembutsu adherent to place the mundane truth as more important than the supramundane. And there are a few different examples I can provide of what I mean by the truth, mundane truth being an ideology of what people want or what they believe Buddhism should be. A book is forthcoming, which probably will take the next 10 years or so, but, but I promise I will be working on that. But for the purposes of today's discussion, I'd like to focus on just one of them, okay? And this is the idea of the term oneness. Okay. When we read about Buddhism in various articles, papers, newsletters, journals, and magazines, this term oneness might make its way into the discussion on many occasions. Oneness seems to be used as a catchphrase that can conveniently be used in many different contexts and is effective in its versatility to conform to people's general views of Buddhism. It is a term that refers to the unity or a solidarity of a group of individuals or the principle that connects all sentient beings throughout the cosmos. It is utilized for its colloquial effectiveness, switching out various Buddhist technical terms such as emptiness or shunyata, dependent co-origination, paticcasamuppada, or thusness, tatata, among others. These technical terms are understood only to those committed in the niche, right? But oneness speaks in a way that can attract the attention of a wider audience. But what does this term mean exactly? It is here that we turn to Tanlon and his discussion of the twofold Dharma bodies. On the one hand, we have the Dharma body of suchness, or Hosho Hoshin, and this is referring to the absolute non-discriminative wisdom that transcends all human logical reasoning and rational understanding. The Dharma body of suchness has no shape, no color, no form, no smell, right? No taste. It is completely undetectable to the human mind because it transcends the ability of the human mind to be able to understand it fully. However, that does not mean that sentient beings are barred from encountering this truth, as there is the Dharma body of compassionate means, or Hoben Hoshin. Absolute non-discriminative wisdom that has no shape or form makes itself known to the ordinary sentient being through compassionate activity. In other words, wisdom expresses itself as compassion through the use of form, i.e. Amida Buddha, the Pure Land. And the sentient being's connection to this dynamic working is through Amida Buddha's calling voice, or the Nembutsu. One might then ask, well, with this brief explanation of the Dharma bodies, where does the term oneness fit in? Right? Oneness is referring to the Dharma body of suchness, Hosho Hoshin. Thus, the final goal of Jodo Shinshu and of Buddhism in general is to be born in the world of oneness. That would be fine, only the problem is that Shinran Shonin explains that our only access to the world of the absolute non-discriminative wisdom, i.e. oneness, is through the Dharma body of compassionate means, Amida Buddha. And this is in large part why we don't chant the Hanya Shingyo as part of our daily ritual. It is not that the Jodo Shinshu in some way disagrees with the teaching of Shunyata, right? Rather, we do not chant this because there is no discussion of Amida Buddha, who is our only way of hoping to encounter the world of Shunyata, right? Or this absolute truth. For Shinran Shonin, there is no salvation without Amida Buddha. There is no viable path to spiritual liberation without the great working of Amida Buddha. So what this means in the context of our discussion is that oneness is inaccessible to the ordinary human mind, the Bonbu. And haphazard discussion of the term oneness is either a superficial understanding of what enlightenment is in Buddhism, or one's lack of understanding that the self is indeed a Bonbu. Either way, the term oneness easily does away with some of Shinran Shonin's core teachings. But why is the term oneness so problematic, right? If it is a colloquial term that seeks to appeal to a wider readership and audience, explaining complex Buddhist teachings in a succinct and effective way, shouldn't that be considered a good thing, right? Although I am all for this approach, and actually I support using this term as long as it's properly explained so as to avoid any misunderstandings, the term nevertheless glosses over a crucially important aspect of Shin Buddhism, soteriology. Simply put, Pure Land Buddhism is a teaching of salvation. Why do we need to get saved? Because we are Bonbu. What are we being saved from? We are being saved from the world of suffering and delusion. Who saves us? Amida Buddha, right? And as people who are tasked with sharing this sacred teaching with others, we might be inclined to use different words that help to soften the bluntness of these explanations. We use terms like spiritual liberation in place of salvation, the misguided individual or egocentricity, the imperfect self, right? To refer to the evil person or Bonbu. Finally, the working of great wisdom and compassion, right? In place of a godlike existence that Amida is often misunderstood to be. Right? We use these auxiliary words and phrases to try and make this teaching a little more palatable to an audience that more often than not is coming from various monotheistic traditions that have a great many things to say about these related topics already. But in the midst of using these euphemisms and various other terms, there is a tendency to forget what this was all about in the first place. In trying to get our voices heard in an increasingly pluralistic world, my concern is that our explanations of Jodo Shinshu Buddhism are straying a little off course. Through the use of such terms as oneness, we are seeking to accommodate what people want to hear about Buddhism, right? And or what people believe Buddhism to be, rather than our sole message of Amida Buddha's soteriological undertaking, that is, the supermundane truth. So let me clarify how the topic of the two truths theory is tied to the issue of oneness. What I argue is that oneness is a kind of ideology of what people perceive Buddhism to be teaching. Again, the term is an accommodation to what people want Buddhism to be. And for this reason, it is on the side of the mundane truth. It speaks to the moralistic, ideological, and unifying truth that is sought in the Saha world. It is what the Buddha taught can never be actualized because it is based on egocentricity. On the other hand, the supramundane is referring to Amida Buddha's salvific working. However, if we continue to kind of bifurcate between the mundane and the supramundane and neglect to talk about Amida Buddha's salvific working, what we are left with is the sole focus on the mundane side, which in this case would be oneness. And this is not what Shinran Shonin talked about. Indeed, it becomes far too easy to prioritize the mundane side because those new or unfamiliar to this tradition think it'd be far easier to relate to rather than the arbitrarily viewed salvific activity of Amida Buddha. A simple example of this is the term other power, which is commonly mistaken to refer to the interconnectedness of all beings rather than Amida Buddha's salvific working. Returning back to the point of oneness, overlooking the crucially important aspect of soteriology in Jodo Shinshu, what that means in concrete terms is that the process of salvation, that of going from point A to point B, is now absent from the discussion. In other words, the process of the individual going from the impure world to the pure world, right? Saha to Ojodo, from this shore to the other shore, Shigan to Higan, from samsara to nirvana, right, gets disregarded when we overemphasize and indulgently use the term oneness. Oneness implies a couple things, which as it happens to be, Shinran Shonin warns us against. The first is to imply that we are able to awaken and realize oneness while in this life. If this were true, then it would mean that we wouldn't need Amida Buddha, for we are already Buddha ourselves. The second is related to the first point, which is that if oneness can happen in this life, then there is no need to go to the Pure Land at the end of one's life. This inherently extinguishes the very need for Pure Land Buddhism itself, as the whole teaching's point is to get to the world where there is no more suffering, right? A world that is starkly different from the one we are in now. Shinran Shonin at the very outset of the Kyogyo Shinsho explains that the framework of Jodo Shinshu is one of the aspect of going forward, also, and coming back, returning, Genso. Both tracks that were established and made available by Amida Buddha. Clearly, Shinran Shonin is referring to a direction here, right? One in which the individual moves from the world of impurity to purity and then back. By overusing the term oneness, we completely undercut the very motivation to embark on the Nembutsu path in the first place. Hence, although the term oneness might be a great catchphrase that helps to attract a wider audience that might be open to hearing about the message of the Buddha Dharma, the term nonetheless siphons off the need for Amida Buddha's salvific activity. And from this example, the usage of the term oneness, we see how an ideology of what Buddhism is perceived to be can undermine the very core message of our teaching. Oneness sounds Buddhistic. It caters to what people want and expect from this religion. And it speaks to a wider audience, not exclusive to the Jodo Shinshu tradition. Our wholesale and unabashed usage of this term steers the attention away from Amida's salvific working and instead focuses on unity and mutual cooperation that is, nonetheless, still based on egocentric motivations. Some of us might be inclined to be okay with this, but that certainly isn't Shinran Shonin's message. Right? He was focused on the helpless and hopeless Bonbu self that he was, whose only path to true salvation was through encountering Amida Buddha's great compassion. This is indeed the supramundane truth. And as Jodo Shinshu Buddhists, isn't this where we should be focusing our attention? To return back to the start of this discussion, we see how the two truths theory enables the mundane truth to be prioritized over the supramundane truth. And as we saw with the example of Imperial Japan and Jodo Shinshu's capitulation to allow state Shinto to be the main focus of this teaching, what we are witnessing here in the 21st century American Jodo Shinshu context is the same possibility to once again move away from the supramundane truth of Amida Buddha's great compassion. The careless usage of the term oneness is one of the ways that attention is being diverted away from the core message of Amida Buddha's salvific activity. Oneness speaks to a wider audience, yes, but at what cost? Because the Jodo Shinshu teaching, if anything, is a teaching of oneness through two-ness. That is, our approach is one of dualism, where the individual moves from the Saha world to one of no suffering. And this is why oneness is problematic to our message. If the term is not used with more reluctance and care, we run the risk of completely throwing out the very need for Amida Buddha in the Pure Land. Hence, the problem of the two truths theory has not been properly addressed in today's Jodo Shinshu, and we should be keenly aware that it still influences the way we portray and propagate Shinran Shonin's message. So I'd like to move on to now the conclusion. The theme of today's Pacific seminar is the significance of orthodox teaching in Jodo Shinshu. How then is this talk about the two truths theory, which I kind of suddenly threw at you here, relevant to this issue of the importance of orthodoxy? The latter half of my presentation looked at the way that the term oneness steers us away from focusing on the importance of the soteriological working of Amida Buddha. But this part is merely the symptom of the problem. I further argued that the two truths theory of bifurcating between two separate but equal truth claims creates the potential to lose focus on the central teaching of Jodo Shinshu. In other words, the two truths theory allows for the possibility to disregard orthodoxy in favor of a Buddhism that is deemed to be more relevant, more accessible, right, and easier to understand for the modern 21st century American. As history has shown us, and Canadians and Australians, okay, sorry, I don't want to leave you guys out too, and etc. As history has shown us, this isn't the first time this has happened, where the soteriological aspect of Shin Buddhism fell to the wayside in favor of a more concrete and more realistic ideology. Rather than to give in to the social zeitgeist of any particular time and space, we need to remember and continue to emphasize the core teaching of the timeless supramundane truth, Amida Buddha's great compassion. Indeed, our very identity as Jodo Shinshu Buddhists is predicated on the indispensable need for this salvific working. Any other truth claims not pertaining to the soteriological working of Amida is not the core teaching of Shinran's thought. And what we can understand from the problem of the two truths theory is what can happen if we forego the need for any orthodox understanding of this teaching. And what is at stake is the Jodo Shinshu identity that has existed since the time of Shinran Shonin. With that, I'd like to close. Please join me in Gassho. Namo Amida Butsu. Namo Amida Butsu. Namo Amida Butsu. Namo Amida Butsu. Namo Amida Butsu.